Sorry, everyone awake now?
Hi, and welcome to our media availability with Vaughan Turekian, Senior Board Director for Sustainability Programs at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Let me get my... Sorry,
Thank you for coming here. It was a great talk you did. So I've got a number of questions here. I'll try not to dominate too much. But, I wanted to ask you a number of questions about the State Department when you were there then and how it is now.
Sure.
So I guess my first question to start with is you started as advisor back in 2015 under Secretary Kerry. So, and you stayed for part of the transition.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell me how you saw the priorities shift? What were the key priorities you saw when you were under Secretary Kerry, and then the shift that happened to start off,
Sure.
please?
So I think of a few things to sort of place it, because I think the temporal piece is actually an important part of it, separate from the political piece. So temporally, when you're in an administration at the end, it's even independent of the topic, its priorities for what it's trying to do are different than when an administration is at its start. So at the end, it's trying to actually reinforce and to implement, to finalize things that have been building up for the many years. So I think that was one of the things that was quite clear, was this idea of bringing to bear or bringing to conclusion many of the initiatives that had started, and then also to try as much as possible to get them firmly implanted in place. So very specifically, lots of things obviously around climate change. So in 2015, a few weeks after, or a few months after I had arrived, there was the Paris Treaty, and that was obviously, or the Paris Agreement, sorry, not the Paris Treaty, Paris Agreement. And that obviously was stuff that had been building up for a long period of time. And then the following year was really designed to see how to keep that, going, independent of the politics, actually, just trying to, how do you take something that's agreed to in December and keep it moving? So that would be the types of things. You'd see, the secretary was particularly interested in topics, in this domain, interested in topics related to ocean, related to climate. So you saw very big, I'd say, global issues oftentimes, and looking at things about U.S. leadership at a global scale, and how the science piece of that fit into that. There was also a whole number of issues that were kind of emerging that were coming in. I mentioned in my talk CRISPR and Cas9 were now issues that were sort of percolating into the system, and the State Department had a role for that. There were issues around artificial intelligence that obviously were coming in because there was a question around the implications for the future of work that were coming in, even the sort of things we're going through. So that was all stuff that you saw in place moving along. Now, the other element of that is you also had even though people were beginning to leave an administration, you still had the senior political leadership as a whole. So even as initiatives were coming to some degree of I would say conclusion, but of robustness, there was a political leadership that could keep those things going and the processes in place. What happens at the start of any administration, but I think was, and it is still more obvious in this one, is that the numbers of people that are coming into political positions and filling the ranks that actually are the ranks that actually get things initiated and started are not there. And so at least from the State Department standpoint, particularly at the undersecretary level, which traditionally tends to be the level that initiates, it's always sort of viewed as the highest political level where you still have a substantive connectivity, that is a place where you're not having as much interaction right now. So those broad initiatives are not continuing. They're the obvious changes in policy that took place. I can't remember if it took place before or after I'd left. It was right around the time of the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the withdrawal from TPP. There were some big decisions made that were looking like they were changing the priority space. The focus was much more on security, explicitly on security, and domestically looking at jobs and the role of the foreign ministry, the State Department in that. And that changed even a little bit in at least the articulation of that. And then, like I said, the whole rethinking about the organization of a foreign ministry is taking up still, if you talk to people, a lot of time. So you're not seeing positions being filled in some ways because they're not either finding the right people that they want to have, or the right people aren't finding them, or whatever that looks like. But also, there's a big question about what positions at the political level are going to stay and what positions are going to either be consolidated or gotten rid of. And I think in that environment, you throw in at least the administration desire to cut an agency by almost a third, or at least not the agency itself, but the broader budget that underwrites, and that's going to have implications for even what that agency is doing going forward. It's a long answer, but what you see is a very big difference between an administration that was, I would say, more focused on global engagement and looking at sort of the big global issues, particularly things like climate and ocean, that had sort of had the structure it wanted, versus an administration that had less of a focus on those global issues and also is changing the structure of the organization in a way to focus on a smaller number of priorities.
Are there any questions from other reporters in the room?
I think Randy had a couple more questions. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the one right
Get back.
We'll mix it up. My name's Keith Rosendahl. I'm from KZSC Radio in Santa Cruz, California. I was wondering about the differences between your position now with the National Academies and your position in the State Department. Like, do you think you have more or less influence, and do you approach the job differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think they're very different positions because one is actually within the bureaucracy of a specific agency. So that was the State Department position. And now being at the National Academy of Sciences, it's a non-governmental advisor to government. And probably the biggest difference is that in some ways, and I think this is true for anyone that's sort of in a government system at a certain level, your ability to focus on any specific issue for more than the day that you're focused on that issue is not very easy. So I would find that I was going across many topics a lot when I was in the State Department, whereas because my focus is very much on the sustainable development and sustainability issues, I'm able to give more focus to that in this current position. I did a little bit of that at State Department. That was one of the things I had in my portfolio, but ability to do a little bit of a more focused, deeper thinking about it, but also thinking, and again, to get to I think your very good question is, the numbers of groups that you interact with when you're advising the State Department are very much focused on an agency, a big agency with a lot of influence globally, but one agency. Whereas when you're dealing with a topic that cuts across not only government, but private sector, non-governmental, local and regional issues, university communities, that interaction is a little bit broader, even as the dive into the topic is deeper.
Are there other questions? Randy?
So shifting back, I wonder if you could tell me what, I'm assuming that you're still a very active observer about what's going on at the State Department. So what, in your opinion, should the State Department be doing now? And how do you feel about the changes that have been going on? Well, if you can give me some specifics.
So my domain was very much focused on the science piece, and so I'll speak to it from that standpoint. I think, and I feel fairly passionately about the fact that there's great value in having a science capacity that's robust within the department. I think it gave and gives U.S. diplomacy a competitive advantage to have access to science and scientists, given the range of issues, even if it's a smaller set of issues you want to focus on, given the range of issues that science and technology and its applications actually have related to foreign policy. And it's not just the traditional things around climate change. Huge issues around competitiveness and economy, economic growth. I mean, you can almost go across with the security side. You can almost, and what I found actually was you can almost look at every part of the Department of State and see people responsible for the substantive interface with it that actually benefited greatly by having either access to the scientists, by getting fellows or others, or by having access to the information and the science that was coming out, oftentimes being produced outside of government because the things were moving so fast. So if I were to give advice in the domain where I existed, it would be to really not allow more time to go by without having some capability to have an advisory capacity within the department. I think that the science advisor is a very valuable way to do that, and that's not least of which because you look at things like the Academy's report from 1999, and then again in 2015, that articulated from great expertise that is actually a valuable contributor. It gives you access to people, it gives you access to ideas, but it also gives you a focal point for bringing that in. And that position has not yet been filled, and my position when I left has neither been filled, nor has there been actually an effort, I think, to even begin that process. And that would be I would say, again, from the domain in which I lived, it actually is not just a parochial view of this. There's actually a great value to it, and it's cut across every administration and every secretary since 2000. So Albright, Powell, Rice, Clinton, Kerry. It makes sense to have that capacity.
Okay, here you go, Randy.
And tell me a little bit about, during your speech, you were talking a little bit about the Paris Treaty, or Paris, not treaty.
Agreement, yes.
Tell me what was going on and what was the general feel and attitude about that within the State Department and within the science part of the State Department when that happened, and likewise when it happened when the Trump administration decided to go forward with Kigali.
So I was not in the State Department when they went forward with the Kigali, because that was just last month. But Paris was in many ways the culmination of an almost 20-year rethink about climate policy that really started in 1997 after Kyoto was signed but not adopted by the U.S. And even at that time in 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was being negotiated, the issues that came up in a fairly, I'd say, broad view, but then it became a little bit more politicized, was you can't have something that doesn't seem to be that disincentivizes or puts the U.S. at a disadvantage economically compared to them, China, and India. And there's lots of, the reasons for it, built on the UN Framework Convention, which had common but differentiated. And so that piece came in, and that was very controversial and contentious, was this idea of what's the obligations of developed countries versus developing countries in this space. I think if you fast forward to 2007, and I'm sorry, about 2007, and then again to 2015, so 18 years after the initial, was two parts, which I thought were interesting. One is you don't make domestic policy from foreign policy, you make foreign policy from domestic policy. And Paris did that, right? Paris built in a lot of mechanisms to think about what countries were going to do at an individual scale and how to bring that into an agreement, and to focus really on the local and the place-based. So the role of cities, the role of municipalities, the activization of those communities in that space, and the idea that there was a value in looking, pledge and review, which was sort of the terminology that's been used oftentimes, looking at those mechanisms to bring that in. I think that what you saw when you saw the negotiators being informed by the science and everything else was a recognition that the Paris Agreement was a way to change the paradigm from looking very top down to looking a little bit more bottom up, and looking at that as a way to begin to get global action, truly global action, in a way that actually recognized that there were certain trajectories that were already taking place, and that going and then evaluating those at a certain time periods actually had value, not only from the standpoint of assessing your progress, but being on the global stage and being able to assess other people's progress. And for that reason, there was actually great excitement that this finally came together, because it came together in a way that did not look like it was unrealistic. It looked realistic. In fact, it built on actually, I would say, a number of initiatives that had even come out from the administration before, the Bush administration, around some technology initiatives, some initiatives that were looking at bringing together some of the major economies to think about things. So it was a conglomeration of all that, while also looking at local action. And so when it came through in 2015, I think there was two pieces of recognition. One was that it really had shifted the debate from the very contentious who goes first, who goes second debate, but also a realization that in getting that done, the pieces done, there were still things that were going to need to be worked out around financing of certain things. What are the things that incentivize around that space? So that was continuing to be worked out, like the Green Climate Fund, and how do you fund that, and how do you make that not just a public sector, or not just another version of developing tensions, but bringing in things like Gates and others. So it was, I would say, through that period was really beginning to develop at least some degree, and it gets to the first question, some degree of consolidation of how to move forward in that. I was not there, like I said, when I think the main thrust of the pullout happened. I think I might have been there, some of it the time I always forget, but clearly there was a view, at least among those that had negotiated it, that it was now the U.S. was withdrawing from something that had been instrumental in clarifying the boundaries, and that it was not, unlike Kyoto, it was not going to be as easy, and it won't be as easy to reconstruct something totally different. Whereas I think even with Kyoto, even when the U.S. pulled out, there were a number of other countries that were also not going to go any further than that. So there was natural groups that were not involved. So you could actually start new initiatives that, even though they weren't the climate change agreement, they were designed to support things like carbon sequestration leadership forum and hydrogen economy, and even the global group on Earth observations. All these things came out of the Bush administration as a counter to pulling out of Kyoto. I don't think you're going to see it that as easy, or a world as willing to look for new things, because they've got something that seems to actually have a fairly broad base of agreement. I think you got the mic.
Tell me, if you can flesh out a little bit more for me, what difference does it make to have your position at the State Department?
Right.
Give me an example of, what difference is it that when you were there and that it's not happening now? I mean,
All right. So
why does it matter?
So I'm going to point to one statistic and use that statistic to explain. So earlier this year, and this preceded this administration, the data. Earlier this year, there's a very interesting demonstration that Jeffrey Mervis did in Science magazine, which showed the funding for basic research in the United States. So not the R&D budget, which is always dominated by the private sector, it's 2/3 public, 2/3 private, 1/3 public. This is basic research. And what it showed in 2015 data was, for the first time since World War II, the federal government was no longer the majority funder of basic research. The basic research actually was being funded, majority was being funded by a combination of private sector, universities themselves, and philanthropies. And that made up about, I think, 55%. What that tells you, and what it told us, was start with a couple pieces. More and more of the issues of foreign policy have underpinning them science and technology, whether it's innovation or security or economics, like I mentioned. And much of that science is actually taking place in places that the government traditionally does not have connectivity to. The private sector, the university community, philanthropies. Oh, and by the way, the second part of that corollary, when it's in the private sector or it's in venture capital, or the translation and the speed from which you're moving from basic to product is happening much faster. So that innovation cycle is happening. You're moving from basic research to product faster. All of that means that for a ministry of foreign affairs, which actually has to deal with issues around trade, has to deal with issues around competitiveness, has to deal with issues around security, understanding what those technologies and those science are, and having access to that community on a regular basis is more valuable than ever. It's diverse. And so having somebody who has the role of science and technology advisor, it's never about the individual. It's about the objective of that person coming from the science community, having links to that community and being able to draw upon it, either by bringing more technical talent to the department. So I mentioned at any given time there are 40 PhD fellows, AAAS and Jefferson Science Fellows in the State Department who themselves had their own knowledge networks they could draw in, but also the constant connectivity to things like AAAS and the National Academy of Sciences and AGU and all those places where you had access to the scientists directly who were doing much of the research and could translate two-directionally, not only the science as it impacts policy, but critically being able to go out to those communities and say, hey, the policy community is thinking about this topic. How does that fit with what you guys are thinking about?
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thank you so much. This concludes our media availability.
Okay.
Up next, at 2:30, media availability is climate intervention in our future.